the typography and reading project. And in this, we're going to talk about the practicalities of setting up a book spread in InDesign and some of the tools where they're hiding and how to use them. To start with, as you'll recall, this project requires actual text to work with. You need real English, because one of the things we're going to be evaluating is readability. And if you use what used to be called Greeking or position text, because it's just gibberish, you can't really use it to judge reading. So you need real text. And the other thing I would say is you need text that is going to be composed of paragraphs rather than, say, dialogue. So we could open up, I think it was this one. And this is just Project Gutenberg. It's a site that digitizes books that are in the public domain. And we could say, read this book in HTML, and it gives us some information at the top. That's not the part we want. But you get here, and there's a lot of dialogue, and that kind of text could work for a novel, but it's not going to work for the textbook, and it's also not best for evaluating the readability of text, because it gives you all these short, choppy paragraphs. So I'm going to go back and back again. And I'm just going to select this one. And if you don't like what they present you, there are 60,000 books on this. And you can do a search, and like anything that's a little bit older and was popular, you're likely to find. But for convenience, I'm just going to grab this one. Takes a little bit to get it open. And here it is. And I'm going to get past the table of contents and the other stuff. And I am just going to grab the text. I'm just going to do a 2-page text spread, which you can do for the novel part. And let's just grab the whole first chapter of that. And I'm just going to hit copy, Command-C on a Mac, or Control-C, I believe, on a PC. And then I'm going to switch to InDesign and set up a document. And it always pays to think a little bit about your documents before you set them up. And that's especially critical for this, because one of the things we're going to be looking at is the relationship between margins and leading and size, and how this works as a coherent system. And I have a lot of students, let me switch this over to inches, who, they just picked the default 8.5 by 11. And that's really setting yourself up for failure from the beginning, because you don't have a sense of the real margins of your book. You really have to, and certainly if you were a professional designer and sending things to press, you have to set things up as the printer expects them. They're not going to do that for you. So I am going to select inches, and I think the size for the trade paperback, I didn't check it, is about 5.5 by 8 inches. And you can just type those in here, or you could click to go up and down in increments, but you could just type those in at any place. The other thing you want to do for a book is you want to make sure you're vertical, in this case, not a horizontal book, and you want to make sure it's set up for facing pages. Let me unclick that option for just a minute. And if it's not facing pages, if it's like a report or something like that, it is going to give you top, left, right, bottom margins. But when it is set for facing pages, it gives you top and bottom margins, just like before, but it now gives you inside and outside margins. And that's because most books are symmetrical. So if you have thumb space on the outside of the page, which we talked about in the other video, then that's going to be on the outside of both pages. You want the pages, for the most part, to reflect one another. So for those, I am going to, let me give myself a little bit more of a generous margin. At the top, I'll say a 1-inch margin. And at the bottom, I'm going to say, let's say 5 point, well, let's leave it at that. And for outside, I'm going to leave it at 1. And then inside, let's just make it, let's just keep it at that. We can change this all later on within the program. And then bleeds, for this you don't have to worry about, and all that other stuff is fine. If you wanted to save this as a preset, if you knew you were going to design a lot of books, you could, but you don't have to. And then you say create. And, ooh, I gave myself too little a margin. So those are just some wacky margins. Let's just do that over again. Now let's just fix that here. So I'm going to go to my Pages panel. And by the way, if you are looking at a different workspace, it's very likely that you are at the Essentials workspace, which really gives you access to much fewer tools than any of the more advanced ones. I have, in fact, I'm such a frequent InDesign user that I have my own custom space that has everything I want in it. But you don't need that. To follow along, I would suggest you switch to Advanced or Typography. Those are fairly similar spaces, but they will give you a lot of the tools that you are not seeing if you were looking at it in just the Essentials space. We can go look at that, and you can see this is just a really dumbed down interface. There's just a lot less stuff here. So let's switch that to, let's say Typography. I'll pick a space that you can follow along in. So I don't like my margins, and I do want a spread. So I'm going to drag a spread down, and you'll note that every page in InDesign has a little A in the corner because I dragged down from my A master, and that's because these pages are based on the A master. I can change them from the A master, but if I select these pages, I can adjust these margins of just these pages. Or if I select the A master, I can adjust the margins of every page that's going to be based on the A master, including these. Now, you're just doing two spreads, so it doesn't matter as far as you're concerned which of those you pick. But if this was a professional book and there was going to be dozens or hundreds of pages, you would probably always want to work on the master. So I'm going to go to Layout, Margins, and Columns, and I accidentally gave myself an inside margin of 0, so let's make that 0.5. And if preview is checked, we can see it in real time. And my top margin, I think, is just a little bit too big, so I'm going to say 0.75. I'm going to leave my bottom as is. And by the way, you can also select the number of columns. This is just a trade book, so it's not a super wide column, so I'm going to leave that at 1. But for the textbook, if you made this a 2-column grid, you would have 2 columns to work with, or 3 columns. It would give you this nice kind of structure to work against. And you would know by using your grid that all your columns are the exact same width. So I'm going to take that down and say OK. So now I am going to, we don't need that at all. Let me just get rid of that. So I am just going to take my text tool, and you can click or you can use it to draw out a text frame. And there's a text frame. And now I'm just going to hit Command V or go to Edit and Paste. And there's all that text we copied from the website. And this text we're looking at much text than we got, because if we look at this little square here, we see that little red thing. That's indicating that this box has more than it will hold. So I am going to just click on that box, and I get a cursor full of type. And then I'm going to click on this next frame, and it creates another advantage of the grid, and this is of course a simple grid, is it creates a text frame that exactly fills that column. And that would be true if this was a 2-column grid or a 3-column grid. It would automatically fill one of those columns and leave the space between columns, what a designer would call the gutter, free of typography. But we don't have a gutter on this page. So here's this text, and it's pretty nice, hearty paragraphs, and I am going to select it all. And the reason I selected all is because my text is still overflowing, and as more text falls into this, I want to make sure that that all the text is affected the same way. There are workarounds, but it's best if you select all your text and you get it the same way. And we see that it's Minion Pro. That's the default typeface. It is 12 point, which is, if you is really big. I mean, you might see a kid's book, a picture book for real early readers where type is that big, but most adults are reading somewhere between 8.5 and 10.5 points or 11. And the other thing you'll notice about this is that the type is in parentheses. And what that means is that the leading is being determined automatically by the printer. So if I take all this type down a size, let's just take it down to 11 and then 10, the leading changed along with it. So the leading is now 12, and the leading is pretty obvious to tell now that it's at 10, is the leading is at 20%. And for a lot of purposes, that's a pretty nice leading, but even so, it's kind of a default. It's better to make your own choices about leading and do it yourself. And there's another disadvantage to auto lead, which is because it is dependent on the size of the character, you can take any character, and let me just go to type, show hidden characters. Let's zoom in a little bit. And there are all these characters, and sometimes there's many, many more than you see here that do not print. And one is that little blue dot between characters. That's just, the space bar. And then this is the symbol that indicates end of paragraph. And we can see that there's an extra one there. That's how paragraphs in this text as it has come in have been defined, is there's just an extra return in between those paragraphs. So the disadvantage of auto lead is because it is dependent on size. If that space bar, and I'm just gonna make that a little bit bigger, and this one I'm just gonna use my space, the key command, which is just Option Shift and your right caret. Make that space bar a little bit bigger, and all of a sudden I have uneven leading. And so that's like one little mistake that leads to another one and starts to make these look like you're not sure whether they're separate paragraphs or not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this all back down to 10. And then I am going to take my leading down to 12. That's exactly what it was before as auto lead. But now, if I use the key command again and make that character bigger, it doesn't affect the leading. It just affects the spacing a little bit. So that's really a better way to work. So that is one of the things you're looking at is font, and there are a few fonts prescribed for this. It's because I don't want you to get too bogged down in picking a typeface. Picking a typeface seems like it's the most important thing, but if you have, a kind of functional readable face, it's fine. And so you can explore the fonts that I give you as an option for this project, but don't get too distracted by the font choice. Really, what matters is how the font relates to the spaces and the margin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the typeface to something else. I will just pick Miller Text, and probably what you want is all of these come in a few weights. And for body, you almost certainly want the Roman or sometimes the light, but usually the Roman is where you want for readable text. If we took this and we made it all bold, it starts to feel very heavy and weighty on the page, and it's less attractive, and it's also less efficient. So one of the things this font is doing is it's taking up more room because a bold letter is wider than a narrow letter. So let's take this all back down to Roman. And I would say if you're evaluating a text font, at a minimum, you want a font that has a Roman weight and also an italic, because there's often a lot of italics in the text, or at least a few, and you will need the italic for emphasis. So there's that. Here is leading. Let's just increase that leading a little bit so it feels a little bit more open on the page. These are my first efforts, and then we have various type controls. We could do all cap, but you would never do that for text. You could cross out. That has purposes for legal documents and a couple other things. You could do caps and small caps. That also makes it harder to read. People read lowercase letters faster and easier than they do all caps. Caps slows them down. And we also have some alignment choices. And the other thing I should point out is we have two similar menus up here. One is sort of character driven, where you see the font and the name, and some of these things will duplicate. But if you're looking for something and you don't see it, it may be in the other menu. So this is other paragraph controls, so you for indents and those sorts of things, and we'll look at those in a minute. But I think I'm also going to justify this text. And there are a couple of orientations that are used for running text. One is flush left. You see that usually on the web. Most websites are flush left. Most magazines, newspapers mix them up a bit. But for a lot of things, a lot of books, the text is justified. And the one right under the ragged right is the one you want to use most of the time if you want justified text. There are a couple sort of novelty ones. You can have the last line centered. I think that just looks a little bit goofy and distracting. That it just calls too much attention to itself. It's a little bit weird. You can also do what's called a force justify, where all lines get pushed to the end. And that is actually useful, I would say, 2 to 3 times a year. That's a really useful thing to have. But for most purposes, using that is going to give you this sort of monolithic block of text. And we'll look at it again when I get rid of these extra returns. And you'll see what I mean by it just becomes sort of overwhelmingly monolithic. And then you can also flush right. That's sometimes used for headlines. And you can, of course, center. You wouldn't use those for text, but they are there for later on. And then there are a couple newer ones in here that are just a little bit goofy. You can align to the margin or against the margin, or to the margin, so that you're left right on one side, left right on the other. I don't know when that would ever be practical, but I'm going to do that. Now, the other requirement for this is you have to indicate your paragraphs with a indent rather than extra space. And books and magazines always do that, or almost always do that, for a couple of reasons. One, it's less expensive. Two, if you do have lots of dialogue, short little lines of dialogue, it becomes very expensive to indicate paragraphs like that. You're blowing all this extra white space and air into the page, which isn't often attractive, and you're committing to printing pages and pages more than you would if you used a simple indent. So I'm going to get rid of these extra returns, and you're only working on 2 pages. So you could do this manually, but in InDesign, there are a lot of things you can do with search, and there are a lot of preloaded searches that you can use. And you can also write and save searches. So fake to style italic, for example, is a search I created for cleaning up manuscripts that come in to me. And one of the preloaded ones is multiple return to single return. And so I can just say find next and then change all. And it tells me how many paragraphs there are, which is 30, and how many it's changed. And so there we have those all eliminated. So now what I can do is, again, select all this text. And this time I have to go to the paragraph tool. And this one here is for your first line indent. And this one here is for your entire paragraph indent. So if you're doing something like a block quote, which some books and some magazines have, you could put in like the whole thing. But we're not doing that. And you could do it on the right side too. You can put space above or below a paragraph, but what we want to do is just do a simple indent. And because I set this document up in inches, the trouble with working in inches is it can be a little bit clunky because it's giving you these long fractional percentages, decimal percentages. So I would just switch back to, I would say points, because this is type and that's the measurement of that's a unit of measurement for type. So I'm going to make my indent, I'm going to say we have 10-point type, so I'm just going to say I'm going to say 10 point and give that a try. And just click out of that so it takes effect. And there we go, and that is the spread. Now the other component these need to have is a page number. And what I would do if this was a real book is I would do this on my master page. I would draw a text frame here. And I'm going to say name of the book. We'll say color purple. And then I'm going to, this I do want to center. And I think I also want to center it vertically, so it's exactly halfway between the start of my text and so I'm going to go the start of my text and the edge of the page. So I'm going to go to text frame options, and you can eyeball this too, but this is the way I usually do it. And under alignment, I'm going to say align center and hit OK. So I think I will make this a contrasting font. Let's just put it in there it is, Whitney. And it is still the default size and leading. The leading doesn't matter here because there's just one line, so it doesn't matter what the leading is. But I think I'm going to make this all caps. And I think I'm going to take it down in size using the key command. That's the command shift again, but this time the left arrow, or the comma key, and take that down to 10. Now across the Creative Suite, if you want to copy something, you could hold down your Option or your Alt key and drag it over here. We'll just say Alice Walker, and do the drag again to the bottom of the page. And because our bottom is not the same margin as our top, this box needs to be squeezed down so it fits. And here I'm going to put a special character, and there's a lot of special characters. If you don't, some of these require key commands to get to, but you can find a drop-down menu for a bunch of special characters and a bunch of different thicknesses of white space and other things. But I'm going to go to Insert Special Character Markers, Current Page Number. And it just turned to an A. Why did it turn to an A? Because we are on that A master. And by the way, we could duplicate that A master. We could create other masters. For a book like this, you'd probably only have one master, or maybe two, depending on how the front matter is set up, or for chapter openers. But for something like a magazine, you might have 8 or 10 masters. My magazine has just about that many. So now we have these appearing. Ooh, what happened to that one? Oh, I forgot to copy it. let's just do that again. And so now we have page numbers, and these are going to populate throughout your entire document. And they can start, you can start a page to start on a number other than 1 or 2. We have this spare page up top, and if that annoys you, or if you don't want to spend the money printing it and you just want to hit Command P rather than selecting your pages, we can say, unselect this fairly confusing option. It says allow document pages to shuffle. If I unselect that, I can pick this page and then I can delete it, and all I'm looking at is my spread. And there it is. And this is really, this or something like it, is maybe a first step to printing it. And what I'd like you to do is print these all and then evaluate them on paper, because it is really hard to evaluate something meant to be seen in the real world on screen. I mean, for one thing, we can zoom in and we could look close, so you don't get a sense of it seeming like the type can seem very big or very small when it's really something else. But these seem to be fairly pleasing, and I think this is a first step for printing this out. And then you can start adjusting it with your margins. And I suggest doing the margin adjustment if you decide to adjust your margins, because if you just pull your box in a little bit or out a little bit, it'll work, but then it gets harder and more of a headache to know that these are both the same size. So print these out, evaluate it, and then do another version. And again, it's not about testing different typefaces, it's about getting your margins and your page numbers and your header information and your leading and your sizes all kind of in harmony. And it's easy to take it out of harmony. We could go, we could say select all of this, and we can do a force justify, and we can tighten up that leading. And I'm just holding down my Option key and my up arrow and down arrow. And you can turn this into something pretty unreadable and pretty unworkable quickly. But it takes some time also to do the opposite, to get it into a nice place. So let's undo all of that. And let's redo that. And that would be a place to get a print. And when you print, and I advise you to print it out with what are called crop marks. And if I'm not going to print this because I can't show it to you on screen, but what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to export it to PDF. And this is just untitled. I should have given it a name, but I didn't. So we'll call it test page. And instead of JPEG, I'm going to make this a PDF for print. You can print right from InDesign if your computer has access to a printer. But if you're sending a page to someone else to print, you're probably sending them PDFs. So I'm going to save. And this dialog box looks almost exactly like the print dialog box, except it has some options that it doesn't for viewing. So the view is default, and I think we just want to look at a single page. And for marks and bleeds, I'm just going to choose crop marks. Bleed marks are if the ink is going off the edge of the page. There's marks for where that goes. Registration marks for a press is so that if you're printing multiple colors, they get lined up. It's sort of like a little target for color. Most printers don't want you to use any of these, the color bars, because they have their own system that inserts all that stuff that they like better and that is more robust than what InDesign gives you. So I'm going to select crop marks and view PDF after exporting. We want to do that. So let's say export. Oh, and make sure that you are not double-sided printing, which I know in the lab they do by default, but it doesn't do you any good to print these both out if they're both on the same page, because you can't look at them together. So that's just telling us the text is still overflowing, which we know and we don't care about for this project. So I'll say OK. And there is my PDF of my page. And these crop marks are just indicating the edge of the page. So I'm going off my viewing area a little bit, but they're there at the bottom too. And the best way to cut these out is not a scissors, but a straight edge, preferably a metal one if you have one, and a razor blade or an X-Acto knife, and that'll give you a nice crisp line. Then you can tape it into a spread, put the tape on the back so the tape doesn't become a distraction on the front, and you can start to see how these things interact in real life rather than just on the computer. And I can almost guarantee you that you'll be very surprised the first few times that what you're looking at on paper is so different than how it seems when it's on screen. So that's that. You're doing that for the book and the trade paperback and also the textbook. For the textbook, you could set this for 2 columns. You can also, or 3 columns, you can also make a text frame, multiple columns. And you can drag these down. They don't have to start at the top of the page. And if you did a chapter opening or a picture, you can move these around to insert art. So that's much of the technical information you need for getting started with this project.